afternoon, everyone, and lovely to see you here this afternoon. I'm joined by Professor Jean Cushen from Maynooth University, and delighted to have her. Jean is our eminent an academic fellow who has got that recognition from our Global Institute, and we're delighted, as I say, to have her as part of our academic programming over the period. Maynooth is a partner university of ours, and we would accredit a number of the MSc level courses there. And they've been a loyal supporter of the Institute over many years, and we take this opportunity to thank Jean as well for her continued support over the years. The Institute is kind of continuing this professional CPD program and offering interesting, I suppose, observations in terms of the discipline and profession of management consultancy, and looking at, I suppose, the cutting edge, both in practical, pragmatic, but also the academic side of the house as well. For that purpose, this afternoon, we're fortunate. We're going to be looking at the sustainability capabilities for consultants, and Jean is going to take us through some recent research. Now, this is an in-camera event to a degree. We are recording it, but we won't be releasing the recording until the actual details are launched in a couple of weeks' time. So you won't see that coming out. So you're getting really raw data here, cutting edge kind of insights. So you may find them particularly interesting. As I say, it's not me you're here to see, but please feel free to reach out with an email afterwards if you have any queries. Jean has been kind enough to say that she'll come back to us when she has a moment to catch up on them. So Jean, Akara, Garamila Mahagat for stepping in. It's been a while since we've spoken in this kind of capacity, and again, looking forward to having a cup of coffee out with you in Maynooth in due course when the new stick of students come in later in the year. But in the meantime, if I could ask you maybe to take the ship out and share our thoughts. We will have some questions and answers at the end, such as people have, and please feel free to use the chat box in the first instance, and I'll monitor those, and we'll ask Jean of any questions that are coming up. So I'd say maybe 35 minutes, give or take, Jean, and we'll do a Q&A, and hopefully we'll get you out for a sandwich and a cup of soup at the back end of it.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Pat, and hello to everybody in the room today and anybody who is listening or at a later stage. So I'm going to be talking today on the topic of sustainability capabilities for consultants. And when coming at this issue and my earlier discussions with Pat, we thought it'd be useful to share some of my current research working with business leaders, with top business executives on sustainability capabilities for business leaders, and to present those findings and explore what that actually means for consultants who are interested in playing a leading role in this space. So before I get into my own project, I think it's worthwhile considering the market for sustainability that the consulting world is operating within. And you often hear the expression that the sustainability transition is the largest change management process of our time. And of course, consultants have always played a really important role in guiding change within organizations. You know, consultants are bringing the expertise, of course, but also the change management toolkits, the frameworks, the diagnostics, the capability models, the benchmark data, the best practice insights, all those systems and processes, and also that external legitimacy that comes with bringing somebody into a change management process that has done it successfully elsewhere. So consultants have a huge role to play in guiding Irish Inc., as the expression goes, towards becoming a more sustainable economy. So in monetary terms, the sector has boomed in recent years, estimated to be valued at approximately 11 billion in sustainability consulting in 2022. And then there's quite a wide range of projections going forward, but all of them are about growth. So that the expectation is that as regulations increasingly come through in different jurisdictions, and then also through changing business models, that the space for consultants will continue to grow. So we're all probably somewhat aware of the factors that are driving the growth of consulting on the topic of sustainability. So we see, you know, this emerging system in Ireland, this emerging ecosystem of push and pull factors. So, you know, the push factors being the actions or the initiatives that are, you know, pushing organizations and leaders to care about this when they mightn't otherwise have the space to. And the obvious one that we all know of is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. And then there's also the national guidance on net zero by 2050 and all that kind of national level regulations that are in place at the moment. Then there's the pull factors where business leaders, and in my discussions with business leaders, they're increasingly reporting that it's a really being sustainable is a really important part of their employer brand. And in some sectors, consumers are looking for it more. In other sectors, it's less. Consumer behavior is slower to change. And then in other sectors, the pull factors are appearing in way of government incentives. So, for example, green mortgages and all the kind of different tax incentives that governments are trying to are trying to introduce to encourage more sustainable behaviours. And when you look at change management, then for an ecosystem really to kind of move along the transition, you need the push factors for sure. To have a baseline of change, but for an ecosystem to really mature into a new space, in those pull factors have to become really prominent as well. And that came through in the research in terms of what do we need to enable the change in Irish industry. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So it's huge in the consulting space in Ireland has evolved a lot in the last decade. There's a lot of boutique firms providing very specific forms of consultant expertise on different topics of sustainability. And then, of course, obviously, the large consulting houses are doing great work in this space as well, particularly in guiding organizations and to align with the CSRD and all the due diligence and metrics and things like that to be in place for that. But also on the wider look at what wider thinking about business models and new forms of revenue that organizations are trying to stimulate. So for consultants themselves, then there's that direct sustainability expertise that some consultants are bringing, very specific on, some element of environmental issue, social issue, or governance issue. But increasingly, most consultants, even if this is not their primary area of expertise, they have to be somewhat versed in the space. So, in my own background, I worked as a HR consultant or human capital consultant, as we call ourselves, for Towers Watson, the social side of the ESG space has increasingly fallen into the HR domain. So all consultants need to be well versed in the relevance of the ESG transition for their work. When I say commitment, I think that's something that's really important. Everything we know about what it takes to change, what it takes to innovate, to solve complex problems, is that people really need to be committed to figuring out new ways of doing things. So everything we know about, corporate culture, about like organization values and cultures and ways of doing things, that there needs to be a genuine commitment to not just adhering to regulations, but to actually crafting a more sustainable business, like the expression is a strongly sustainable business model. And I don't think it's ever going to be the case that everyone is completely aligned in their views, but for consultants, I think it's important to consider what motivates you when you're advising organizations, and are you more interested in the kind of the regulatory compliance piece, or are you more interested in that kind of figuring out the new world kind of piece? And so that's when in all conversations about sustainability and industry, the term wicked problems emerges increasingly, and a wicked problem is one of those problems that are systemic and wide-ranging, but they're ill-formulated. The information is confusing. There's many people involved. They have a lot of conflicting views. And when you take action, the ramifications are actually quite unpredictable. And we see that in all conversations and dialogues and initiatives about sustainability, where there's competing interests, there's competing views on what's going to work, on whether even action needs to be taken. And even when action is taken, sometimes there's unintended consequences. And we see all that with, even with electric vehicles and batteries and all those kind of consequences that we only learn about after change is made. So
and Jean, question for you.
yeah.
Just an interesting, we get a lot of queries in from members, for example, who are transitioning from ESG to CSRD in terms of their service provision. Purely from a practical perspective in terms of where the rubber hits the road. Are you seeing that in your research as well, that there's an evolution from kind of the more general ESG sort of consultancy to specific consultant areas?
Yeah, well, I have been attending what are termed kind of communities of practice with SkillNet over
Yes.
recently, and certainly the case that CSRD is the topic of focus at the moment. Within that, then there is, with CSRD, the ESG components are there within CSRD, and I think what that prompted is more of an understanding of how they fit together, whereas they used to be quite distinct, or they were dealt with in very distinct ways. And say the social is very kind of the HR domain. You've got quality, diversity, inclusivity, all that kind of thing, whereas the CSRD is kind of requiring more like joined up thinking. And actually, in the research that I did, one of the consulting firms participated in that, and the views of what the managing partners were saying, that they're finding that their project teams for CSRD type initiatives are more interdisciplinary than they would have been, or they would be in other areas. So that's the seems to be the emerging shift that CSRD has prompted.
Yeah, no, thank you. That would echo our own experience, but it certainly has become, trends are trends, but it's certainly the mega trend at the moment. It's soaking up all the oxygen in the ESG and sustainability space.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a value in that for sure, because I mean there's plenty maybe that the system that will be introduced that should benefit over the longer term, but at the moment it's very much prompting the short term kind of focus on reporting, and so hopefully it's a kind of a necessary push factor that will help stimulate kind of broader pull factors for wider change. Okay, so so I'll talk a little bit now about the research project. So Business in the Community in Ireland are a boutique consulting firm, a non-profit organisation whose mission is to lead Irish business to be more sustainable and inclusive. And many organisations in Ireland are members of BITC, and worked with 5 of their members, so one from the energy, one from finance, one from pharmaceutical, one from law, one from consulting, and worked with their top teams to look at sustainability capabilities for business leaders. And the report will be on the project will be issued by SkillNet in the coming weeks. And so what I'll do is just give you a whistle stop tour, some of the key findings, and again, just an exploration of some of the consequences for consulting, but I'd be really interested as well in hearing your own thoughts on the significance of it as well. So but just to say where this project emerged from, when you look at a lot of the existing leadership and guidance on ESG, on sustainability, it kind of falls into 2 camps. So you have all the leadership guidance, which focuses a lot on leadership behaviors. So, if you're leading an organization to be more sustainable, you need to have these kind of values. You need to have these kind of competencies about thinking long term, for example, valuing equality, and having strong listening skills, all those kind of interpersonal traits that leaders need to have to start changing, to start rethinking a business strategy for longer term positive impact. And that's really useful and it's really important. But then on the other hand, but that's very individualistic. And then on the other hand, you have the guidance that's very topic specific. So you have things like the IBEC guide for I should come up some head. So the IBEC guide for climate action. You have the SDG impact standards for enterprise. You've all kinds of different. You have the CSRD obviously, and you've all kinds of different guidance on specific ESG topics. And so for business leaders, what they're feeding back in their forums with BITC was that it goes from being kind of really vague on one hand to being too specific and kind of on the other hand. So really, where are the frameworks for business leaders in order to help them take action and capabilities? You look at what capabilities are, it's quite distinct from competencies. It's all about someone's ability to actually meaningfully and consistently take action on something. So in order to do the research, a sustainability capabilities diagnostic was designed, and that was that's my part of the research. And then we implemented that diagnostic amongst the leadership teams, the participating leadership teams. So 46 leaders completed the diagnostic in total. And then also when you get into the literature on sustainability and change, there's a lot of work on what are called discourses of delay. So there can be widespread belief that, of course, this is important, and yes, I believe that there's a climate crisis occurring all around us, but, it's not down to me. It's not, I can't do it right now. I can't do it like this, or maybe there's a bit of futility there. It's already too late. It's my actions are of no consequence. So we looked at all these different things that had to be incorporated into the diagnostic, and I'll just present the diagnostic, the overview of it, and I won't go into it in too much detail. I'll go more into the findings, but it's just to give you an overview of what it actually looks like, and to say that the next stage now, the iteration is, we are working to adapt it for different uses, but the goal, in keeping with the kind of collective view of the transition, is to have it open access for any organisation to complete. So if you're interested in looking at the diagnostic in more detail, we can certainly talk a bit more.
Thank you.
So the diagnostic itself, so the first part consists of 20 statements asking leaders to indicate their views on sustainability and their role in delivering it for the organisation. And then there's 6 different capabilities valuing sustainability. And there's 9 statements within that. And that leaders ranked then, whether they're a newcomer or explorer. Adaptive action, which is, you're just taking action now, the kind of systems you have for kind of trialing and experimenting. Critical systems thinking, so the extent to which you're looking across your entire value chain, so kind of the scope 1, 2, 3 impact. And you actually hear a lot of consulting firms talking about them being clean businesses, and, that the environmental piece is not so relevant for them. But of course, when you get into critical systems thinking, what you're looking at is your customers and your clients, and the kind of advice that you provide and who you provide it to, and whether you have any ESG kind of parameters around that. So futures literacy is the longer term piece on long-term planning beyond 5 years. So, and then from the consulting perspective, if you consider the governance of it, with the many consulting firms operate on the basis of managing partners and equity ownership. So, how well is the governance crafted to encourage those decision makers to have that strong futures literacy bent, so that you're actually, incentivized to think longer term and beyond your own leadership role in the organization. So then supporting fairness, the idea of the just transition, and then leader development. And so there's 9 statements within each of those, and each of those is broken out down to ESG. So that means the results can be filtered by elements of capability, so strategy, structure, and cultures, or the ESG statement within that. It's a lot of detail that you don't really need, but just to give you a sense of how comprehensive the diagnostic actually is. And then the leaders indicated where they felt they were now and where they'd like to be in 3 years' time. And then there's some open text questions then as well. So, okay, so, but the nuts and bolts of diagnostic are crafted around these 6 core capabilities. And these were arrived at through the dialogues with the top role in each of the participating organizations. So just to give you a sense then of some of the findings, these were the 20 statements on beliefs and discourses of delay. They're adapted. So even with this section, 20 questions could be narrowed down to 5, and likewise with the different
It can be augmented in
so,
due course.
yeah. So then in terms of the findings, just even on the first section of the beliefs and the potential for discourses of delay. So in red here is an indication of the complexities that exist within the leadership teams. And again, these are organizations, as Mark mentioned, have the resources, have been thinking about this for quite a period of time. And, when you consider the complexities that they're facing, you can only imagine or only appreciate how stark these would be for other organizations. So the organization's talking about how the blockers to progress primarily outside the organization, having carbon emissions will involve disruptive change. And when you look at those two things together, so you're talking about disruptive change that has to happen outside of the organization. So you really start to see like the role of the wider ecosystem. Organizations, mixed views on whether they can transition away from environmentally problematic products or services until comparable revenues have been identified. And then also a majority of customers not accepting higher costs for sustainable products and services. So again, you see the classic thing of the financial imperatives being blockers to change, and showing how a lot of untangling those issues, a lot of that action, all that work has to be done outside of the business. It involves wider policy stakeholders, wider incentives, and that kind of thing. But many businesses really do feel like it is, they do feel this is an important part of their role. They want the organization to be more sustainable. They feel essential to the financial future. So there isn't that widespread skepticism that might exist in other jurisdictions. They certainly buy into the idea of it. It's just the realities of, what consumer behavior essentially.
Mm.
So then when we get into the actual capabilities themselves, then so the lighter green here is the current level of capability, the target level of capability, and again, the larger organizations, the ones with the resources. When I say still at the explore stage is about kind of trialing and experimenting, and they're in that phase of figuring out what's going to work.
Gene, would you
Delivering the results.
differentiate to that point that was made previously in terms of startups? Are they, startups, are they stitching in the sustainability agenda from the get-go, or do you separate out? It'd be interesting just, I suppose, to establish from a startup perspective, from an architectural kind of establishment perspective, if they are filtering in that perspective from the get-go, as opposed to small SMEs that are in play at the moment, to the point made previously.
So we did some preliminary work on kind of micro-sized firms of less than 10, like working with founders, and the newer organizations are for sure.
Okay.
And it can often be the case that it's part of their business model, that it's part of their sources of revenue, rather than being an add-on, which is the way it is for a lot of organizations. And so there's definitely it's definitely emerging, but it's I think most of the challenges exist for the organizations, the smaller organizations don't have the resources, and this isn't part of their kind of their daily bread and butter. And even with the incentives, a lot of the incentives are targeted at larger organizations as well. So, but then in terms of the capabilities, and you look at the scores, and you can see there's quite a wide range around each capability. So the points at either side of the line indicate the different range of scores. And when you look at the ESG space, a lot of the organizations are really good on the social. So the social element of ESG dragged up the overall score. Dragged, not the best word, but brought up the overall score. And of course, employment terms and conditions and things like that in Ireland are quite strong. There's been a lot of work done on, inclusivity, diversity, all those kind of initiatives. The lower scores really were on the environmental side. And so there still is a lot of work to be done, even in the larger organizations, on implementing the environmental capabilities and the governance associated to try and drive that. So even putting in governance criteria, CapEx spends that relate to environmental factors and so on. But definitely the social is where we're strongest at. It's the environmental and governance piece that needs that needs more work. And so then in terms of where they want to be in the next 3 years, so a wide variance in terms of the levels of ambition. But for the most part, wanting to get into the exemplar space where you have systems that are working, and that sustainability is a core part of the business strategy. So, and again, the futures literacy piece is the you consider consulting work and the kind of service that consultants provide, that kind of longer term brainstorming of what sustainability means over, in the next 3 to 5 years and 5 years and beyond. So I think, with CSRD, obviously the focus is on reporting in the short term, and when the scope of CSRD expands to incorporate smaller organizations, that's going to be their focus as well. But hopefully that isn't to the detriment of the kind of futures literacy over the longer term. So, not to put, it sounds pretty obvious that transitioning to more sustainable business is a complex challenge, obviously. But one key finding that emerged from conversations and from the data that came back is that unlike or when an organization is trying to, say, grow into a new market or adapt to a new technology or implement a new system, there just isn't the same legacy of success with sustainability. There's a real sense of, we actually don't know if this is going to work, and we don't know if mightn't even be consensus on how much we need to do. We don't know if it's going to be financially successful, and we've even seen all those walkbacks on ESG investments from large institutional investors or in the last number of years. So what the business leaders say they need is much more examples of what works, much more sharing of best practice to build up that legacy of best practice insights, of examples, of vignettes, of transitions, successful transitions that other organizations are making. And so I'm going to scroll through now these for the purposes of time. But
In terms
to
of the just transition, obviously we've had a huge model in Ireland here in terms of the Midlands that the commission, the Just Transition Commission. Did you take any kind of snapshot of how that was going, relatively speaking, in terms of this exercise?
Yeah. So the supporting fairness capability was looked at, the work organizations were doing to model impact on stakeholders or to engage with local stakeholders about the transition. And so there's kind of some internal stakeholders, so reskilling of existing employees and all that kind of thing, and that's quite strong. Again, that's the social side, and that's quite strong. So the mapping of who your stakeholders are, first of all, organizations were at different stages of that. So there's the obvious, any impact that you're having on your own consumers and the locality that you operate in. But then, say, there are questions and discussions that need to be had around how far you go on that. So you might be looking at your impact on a local water source, but then do you go this is an example I was given, do you start then looking at nature within that water source? And so how far do you go to explore the concept of the just transition and who the stakeholders are, and even our future generations stakeholder. Supporting fairness and the statements within that capture the concepts relating to the just transition.
Okay, that's interesting, because I suppose within that concept, you also have the disruption element of the stakeholder engagement with the wind, the big energy ticket issues over the recent years, and there's been a huge kind of canon of work, which is, as I'm sure, backloaded into this research as well.
Yeah. So in those even local stakeholder engagements, it's for leaders and for anyone working in that space, that they're ready to deal with the plurality of views that you're going to experience, even the resistance that you're going to experience, and that you're setting up those consultative forums to engage with stakeholders, so that those kind of changes can be made, and you have some kind of criteria for decision making when you're meeting those conflicting views. Going back to that idea of the wicked problem, that there's lack of consensus about what needs to be done and how it needs to be done. So yeah, absolutely, those kind of consultative forums and the abilities and the resources to manage those absolutely shapes a leader's capability. And and even in talking to different leaders, they're how organized the resistance is to some of these initiatives
Oh yeah,
is
it's
it is
huge
because
issue.
it is something that needs to be that leaders or anyone leading this consultation needs to be prepared for.
Mm.
Mm.
Certainly, we've seen over the last couple of, I suppose, a decade really, and with the advent of community gain coming in as a response to that. But you have that North Mayo episode, which went very pear-shaped, and was a PhD up there in terms of, I suppose, how not to go about community engagement.
Mm.
Then you have on the other side maybe some of the more kind of regional ones in the Midlands on big ticket energy ones where they were done, in a reasonable manner and got good engagement. So there's some very good kind of examples on both sides of the spectrum, good and bad.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And again, from that idea of sharing legacies of success, those building up those vignettes and examples of successful engagement or successful transitions is so important. Um, and then when we looked through all the different findings coming through and the different overview of what leaders said they needed in order to drive the transition, a lot of them are taking those smaller steps, those piecemeal steps, looking at CSRD and seeing what compliance looks like, and all those things are good, absolutely. But over the longer term, there was a sense that they need to start, or there's an appetite to start envisioning disruption. Like if disruptive change is needed to reduce carbon emissions, and there's strong agreement in that to achieve emission reduction targets. So what does that actually look like? And leaders need to unpack that together, because a lot of the change has to happen outside of the organization. Well, what does that change look like? How do whole sectors need to be reimagined? And we can see that happening even say in the construction space, where there's all those different government incentives creating those pull factors that are driving real change and in that sector. And then you see other really problematic sectors like fast fashion, where literally, the pull factors are just not emerging. And the drivers for changing consumer behaviour are just not keeping pace with the negative impacts of that sector. So bringing leaders together to reimagine the sector, the kind of incentives that need to be in place, and all kinds of stakeholders, even kind of go back to that small business issue of small businesses being a vital part of the supply chain. And the role maybe larger organizations have in supporting small businesses, in sharing their own insights with small business, and rewarding small businesses in their supply chain in making their own transitions. So some of the larger retails are working on those kind of initiatives already. So then transforming organizational governance, really looking at the kind of CapEx criteria for, how investment decisions are made, and, incorporating environmental issues into those decision-making processes, looking at, making space for trialing, experimentation, and having that idea of radical transparency, that you want to hear the bad news, and that there are, that you're not facilitating even an internal greenwashing within the organization. So, and then bringing the organizational culture. So some of the organizations are going through a process of looking at individual leaders' KPIs, or at departmental level KPIs and team KPIs and all that, and looking at what contrasts, what needs to be rethought, or where there's opportunities to start working ESG criteria into those. And of course, allowing individuals to bring their own ideas as well. So what do individuals, where do their interests lie? What do they feel they can contribute and give energy to? And so building new sustainability communities of practice to raise shared ambitions, absolutely. That's a real fine for a theme coming through, that the the transition is a collective endeavor, and working on it together is essential. Failing forward, not everything's going to work. Some things will not work. Some things won't ever have a financial business case. But knowing that there's lessons to be learned in each instance, and that that it's some element of experimentation is being facilitated. And then talking all the time about the environment. So, leaders and their behaviors create kind of this implicit system of preferred ways of behaving and preferred values. And so leaders taking on that role is essential to driving change. And most of the organizations that participate in this had already done a lot of work in that space, and that's why they signed up to be involved. And in the open text responses, so many members of their own executive teams spoke about how proud they were to be part of an organization that was driving new practices and achieving kind of new successes in this space. And so it drove a lot of cohesion and commitment amongst the senior leadership teams themselves when the leader was demonstrating a very authentic belief and commitment to the sustainability transition. So, and then in terms of then kind of going back to what it means for the consulting space, obviously different consultants are pitched at provide different kinds of expertise. But it's certainly such a vast area, and the leader spoke about the challenge even in focusing and prioritizing and decisions, and how it can be challenging sometimes when the conversations drift to say, okay, whatever, for example, social issue isn't actually a priority at that time when all of it seems so important and kind of morally and ethically valuable. So guiding organizations to understand the level of change, to reimagine the business models, new forms of revenue, and to kind of bring it beyond the compliance space, even though the compliance space is such a huge piece of work in itself, but that longer term thinking about creating new opportunities, new forms of revenue, and engaging with the wider ecosystem to create all those pull factors that need to be in place to really change consumer behavior as well, so that sustainability becomes financially viable for organizations as well. And there's a real sense that, given our position in the wider economy as a host for so many multinationals and so much foreign direct investment, much of which comes from the States, where there's very conflicting views on an organization's responsibilities towards the environment, that we have a real opportunity to emerge as thought leaders, to do that trialing and experimenting on the part of kind of parent organizations, and to build those legacies of success. And consultants are obviously really well placed to do what they've always done, create those systems, the frameworks that are built on that experience of working within organizations that have successfully implemented a change. So I'll end on that. A bit more time for.
Thank you, Jean. If there's any questions, maybe I'll just ask the first one, Jean, just going back maybe to what you said there a little bit earlier in terms of when you were engaging with the executive teams and the senior leadership and so forth. Would you have kind of asked that question in terms of their, performance-related pay element of the equation, if KPIs are being stitched in now in terms of the ESG metrics? Our experience would be, or the general kind of, I suppose, observation might be that has been a significant driver in behavioral change, where those KPIs are being stitched into the performance-related pay.
So yeah, that question is asked, yes, and I absolutely agree. I mean, even when you look at other things like, say, employee engagement, that really took off and started to be connected into executive compensation. So the scope for variable pay, the way variable pay is constructed, differed across the organization. So I think in financial services, for example, bonuses are still a bit of a dirty word, but what the organizations were working towards was looking at how ESG metrics can be put into exec comp, liaising with the REMCOs to understand what they would like to see. And so I think they're still in the very early stages of it. But where work was being done was more at the lower levels and connecting it into KPIs at lower levels, and then those KPIs would feed into an overall performance rating, which would then lead into a bonus calculation for lower levels.
Okay.
But the exec comp piece, there were varying stages of that, and some hands were more tied than others.
Okay. Has anyone any questions? Mark?
Well, just a couple of, yeah, I suppose two references to, there's a slide I'd like to look at again, if I may, Jean. It was one of the earlier slides, and I was wondering, would it be possible to whiz through them? It was referring to, it was a sort of a paragraph on what needed to be done, I think, in terms of developing narratives. It was an early slide, I think 2 or 3,